Welcome to Poetry Pie. We memorize a new poem every month and interview an expert on that month's poem.
Today we have a very special guest, Moira from Scotland.
Moira was born and raised in Scotland. She is currently a Lord Kelvin Adam Smith doctoral student based in the Centre for Robert Burns Studies, which is part of the Department of Scottish Literature and University at Glasgow. Her doctoral project was based on the physical and mental health and the life and work of Robert Burns. Moira, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
The subject of today's show is To a Mouse by Robert Burns. First, we'll recite To a Mouse for all those who are unfamiliar with the poem. We sleek it, cowering, timorous beastie. Oh, what a panic in thy breastie! Thou needna start away so hasty. We bicker and brattle. I would be laith to run and chase thee. We murder and pattle.
I'm truly sorry
man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt no whiles but thou mun thieve. What then, poor beastie, thou mun live? A damonicker and a thrave's a small request. I'll get a blessin' with the lave, and never miss it. Thy wee bit housie, too, in ruin, it silly was, the winds are strewin', and Nathan out to big and newin', o' foggage green, and bleak December's winds ensuin', baith snell and keen.
Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter comin' fast, and cozy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash thy cruel coulter passed out through thy cell.
Thy wee bit heap of leaves and stibble has cost thee money a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for all thy trouble, but house or hold, to though the winter's sleety dribble, and cranrick cold. But mousie, thou art know thy lane, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft a glee, and lead us not but grief and pain for promised joy. Still thou art blessed, compared with me, the present only toucheth thee. But I backward cast my eye on prospects drear, and forward though I cannot see, I guess and fear.
That was fantastic, guys.
Thank you.
It's lovely to hear the Scots language in an accent that's not Scottish.
So, Moira, can you tell me a little bit about the story behind this poem?
Absolutely. So, most people know this poem as To a Mouse. Its full title is actually To a Mouse on Turning Up Her Nest with the Plough, November 1785. So it very specifically cites the poem in the month of November 1785. Now, at this point in time, Robert is 26 years old and he is on a farm called Moss Giel, which is in Ayrshire, and he lives there. He's currently unmarried, so he lives there with his mother and with his brothers and sisters. They had moved there the year before, but unfortunately they'd had a bit of a rough time. They had bought some bad seed, there had been a late harvest, and so it meant by the time they got to 1785, life was a wee bit tough for them. You know, they weren't starving, but they were having to work hard to make ends meet.
Yeah.
And so what we get with this poem is in November, Robert's out in the field with the plough. It's been harvested, so now they need to turn the soil over so that it's going to absorb all the nutrients from the rain and the snow over the winter, ready for planting again in the spring. And on this particular day, when he's turning over the field, he goes through a stump of grass where a little field mouse has built its winter nest. It's built its nest there so it can hibernate, it can keep safe and warm through the horrendous Ayrshire winters, which tend to be very, very wet and very, very cold. Really quite hard frosts. And on seeing this happen, this causes him to stop and think about this poor wee mouse. And Robert's brother Gilbert reports later on that he basically stood at the plough and he composed this poem at that point. If you want to believe that story, we're not quite sure if it's true or not, but it's nice to think about him seeing that and just being so inspired and putting together these 8 verses of what's now a world-famous poem.
Yeah, that was great. So, yeah, that's a lot more than you might think if you were just reading the poem.
Absolutely, that's it. It's a lovely wee story on its own, but then the more work you put into it, the more you get out of it in terms of looking at the bigger messages behind it, and hopefully we'll tease some of that out today.
Yeah, it seems like the poem can teach you a lot, and the story behind the poem can also be a lesson. So
absolutely.
Okay. So, in the first stanza, what do you think was going on in Robert Burns' head?
Well, so you're thinking at this stage, as I said, he's 26 years old and he's a farmer at this point. He's not yet published poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect, which was his first volume of poetry, which really started to make him a name for him. So he's still a nobody at this point. And what's going through his head is not what you would expect to be going through a farmer's head. A farmer would say, mouse, stealing my crops, eating my seeds, that's bad, we want to get rid of that. Mm-hmm. And the clues there in that first verse where he talks on the very last line, the last 2 lines, he says, I would be loath to run and chase thee with murder and pattle. So this idea of, he sees the mouse being killed, which is what a farmer would be expected to do. He sees that as being murder. He sees it as being a crime to take that little mouse's life. And so what we see straight away, I think, in this first verse are the signs of Burns's compassion and his humanitarianism. Instead of having a go at the mouse and saying, get out of there, you don't want to be, I don't want you stealing my corn, he tries to soothe it and calm it and reassure it, I don't want to hurt you. And that then leads into the second verse where he actually apologises to the mouse. He says, I completely recognise that you're right to be scared of us because mankind treats animals horribly. But he says, me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal, I'm no different to you. I share this land. I'm going to die one day just as you are, and so actually we're all the same and we should all try and get along together.
Yeah, that's a great lesson.
Yeah, that's a great message.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely, and it's a message that we see coming through other poems that Burns writes in later life. This idea of us all being together and about all men, being equal. Money and power and status doesn't put one man above the other. What the real value of the man is in his actions and in his thoughts and how he treats other people.
Right. And the first poem, the third stanza, when it says, I doubt no wiles, what does wiles mean?
Wiles is just kind of sometimes. So I doubt no wiles, but thou may thieve. I don't doubt that sometimes you might steal from me. But what then, poor beastie, thou mun live. But why, why do you do it? Why does this mouse steal from him? Quite simply because he needs to survive. He needs to eat to survive. And Burns can relate to that. His family's working hard to grow the crops, to make some money, to feed themselves. And this mouse is just doing exactly the same. It wants to provide food for itself and for its family.
Yeah.
So, at least when we were studying Robert Burns a little bit, it seemed like he had an incredibly hard life. It seemed like he may have had he may have had an affair and had a child. Could you?
Oh yeah, he's. there's been lots of different things written over the 230 years since Burns died. Some of it is exaggerated and misrepresented, but one of the things that really we can't misrepresent is the fact that he did have a lot of children. He had at least 12 children by 4 different women. And this poem, November, it's dated to November 1785. That very year, Burns became a father for the very first time to a little girl called Elizabeth, and her mother was also called Elizabeth. She was the family servant, so she helped Burns's mother around the house with the cooking and the cleaning and looking after the children and with the milking of the cows and such like. And yeah, obviously something happened between her and Robert, and little Bess was born. But despite the fact that Robert didn't want to marry this woman, he loved that daughter dearly, and he takes her in. Burns's mother Agnes helps to raise her. His poem, A Poet's Welcome to a Love Begotten Child, that was written for Bess, and he talks about how even though she was illegitimate, he still loves her dearly. He loves her as much as any of his other children.
So, okay. So, on the 4th stanza, could you explain that? Like, what he meant by it? And what he was probably thinking when he wrote it?
What he's kind of going through it. So he's starting to think now, by the time we get to the 4th stanza, he's starting to really think about the consequences of his actions. So we see in those first 3 stanzas, he realises that he's frightened this mouse by ploughing through its nest. He's apologising for the fact that he's done so, and generally for the fact that the way mankind treats animals can be quite cruel sometimes. And he recognises the fact that all the mouse is trying to do is survive, which at the end of the day is what we're all trying to do. So by the time we get to this 4th stanza, thy wee bit housey too in ruin, its silly was the winds are strewn. So your house is ruined. The little walls that you'd built for your house out of bits of grass and bit of straw, they're being blown to the 4 winds. And Nathan now to big a new in a foggage green. Because the field's already been harvested, all that's left is that kind of stubble and stump. There's nothing there that the mouse can use to build a new house. And bleak December's winds ensuing, both snell and keen. The mouse can't build a new house. December's coming. It's cold. It's sharp. Burns is starting to think, I've not just destroyed a mouse's nest here. I've actually probably condemned this animal to death. And that then carries on into the 5th stanza. Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter coming fast, and cosy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell. The wee mousie thought that it could live there nice and warm in its little its nest. It had followed its instincts. It had done what nature tells it to do. It had built the nest so that it could cuddle down for the winter, and it could survive the hard snow and the frost that was coming until the spring arrives and things start warming up and food starts becoming more easily accessible. Till crash, the cruel coulter passed out through thyself, till I came along with my plough and I destroyed it all. So this is Burns recognising that it's not just he's ploughed the field, but he's destroyed this nest, and in doing that he's probably destroyed this mouse's chances of surviving the winter.
Right.
I did have a quick question. If you know, do you know if Robert Burns actually took in the mouse and cared for him?
I have no idea. It's a really lovely idea. It's a very sweet image. I suspect the mouse would have run off pretty quickly.
Right.
I think what we see here with the poem is him turning over the mouse's nest, and then kind of thinking on that. I think in that very kind of moment, the mouse probably would have run off to try and hide somewhere else. So unfortunately, I don't think we would have had Robbie having a wee pet mouse at home over the winter, I'm afraid. But, he was living in houses where the roofs were thatched with straw, so there was probably plenty of stuff living in them anyway.
Yeah. Okay. And, let's see. So the 6th stanza?
Mm-hmm.
What does he mean to though the winter's sleety dribble and cranrich cold?
To thole the winter's sleety dribble and cranroot cold. I love these 2 lines. They're so infused with that Scots language. One of the things that I love about Scots is that there's particular words which are really, really difficult to translate into standard English, because whatever you try and translate them into, you can't really properly capture what you mean. And you get that here with the use of the word thole. So the best translation of thole is to tolerate or to put up with something, to endure it, even though it's really really unpleasant for whatever reason. So, we might talk about, I can't thole him. I can't stand that person. I don't want anything to do with them, but I have to put up with them for whatever reason. So he's talking about, so the mouse has got to thole the winter's sleety dribble. It's going to have to put up with the wind and the snow and it being horribly wet and horribly cold. And then that cranroot cold, cranroot's another one of those great Scottish words. Because we have such terrible weather over here, we have a lot of wonderful words to describe how terrible the weather is. My own personal favourite, I think, is dreich, which is just kind of grey and wet and miserable. And cranroot's another one of them. If you go to a Scots dictionary, it'll describe it as being something like frosty, but it's more than just being frosty. It's not a kind of lovely winter scene frosty with icicles sparkling. It's properly hard, biting, chill you to the bone kind of frost. And to think about this poor little mouse, helpless and having to survive that, through these 2 lines, Burns really gets across that this mouse has got a really, really hard time ahead of itself.
And what do you think he meant in the 7th stanza? But Mousie, thou art know thy lane, and proving foresight may be vain.
So here we're starting to get to the kind of one of the big messages of the poem. So he's talking to the mouse directly, but although he's talking to the mouse, it's more about him kind of thinking out loud here. So he's saying to the mouse, you're not alone. Okay, you're not alone in this. You have tried. Instinct has told you to look forward to the winter that's coming and to try and create some place that's warm and safe for you to stay. So you've had the foresight to think, to plan ahead. And we are the same as that. Mankind's the same. We try and plan ahead for the future to give ourselves a warm, safe place to live and food on the table and money in our pocket. And then we get to what are probably the most famous lines in this poem. The best laid schemes of mice and men gang after gley. It doesn't matter how well you plan. Often things will go wrong. And Leah's naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Even though we thought we had planned ahead the best we possibly could, we thought we were going to be safe, we thought we were going to be warm, we thought we were going to be happy and healthy, something entirely unexpected, completely unpredictable comes along and scatters all that to the wind.
And when it says, and Leah's not but grief and pain for promised joy.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? And Lee, how does that translate?
So Lee, so you'll see it when you see it written. Lee, it's Lea apostrophe E. The apostrophe just indicates that the V there's missing. So it's and leave us nothing but grief and pain for promised joy. So the promised joy that all of our planning should have brought us. You know, for the mouse, that's the promised joy of surviving winter and making it through to spring. For Burns, it's the promised joy of planting your seeds and getting a good harvest at the end of the summer. Things go wrong, and it leaves you nothing but grief and pain. It leaves you nothing but a destroyed house and trying to survive a harsh winter. It's bad seeds and a late harvest, and so your yields are less than you expected, so you're not going to make as much money as you thought, so you have to work out, how am I going to make ends meet until next harvest?
Right.
And
okay.
Why do you think that he was he was affected enough by his encounter with the mouse to write a poem about it?
Or why do you think he was so sympathetic towards the mouse? What would have caused him, or what would have made him like that? You think his hard life earlier, or?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things playing into this. So sometimes you hear Burns described as the ploughman poet, which is a bit of a nickname that another famous Scottish writer gives him in a few years' time, a writer called Henry Mackenzie. And so you get this image of Burns as being the kind of farmer boy from Ayrshire who's relatively uneducated, and there's some kind of divine inspiration going on in terms of him writing this kind of poetry. But the reality is that education was actually really important to Burns's parents, and they paid for him to get some education. And Burns was desperately keen to learn himself. He was an avid reader, and you can tell, you know, from reading his letters, you know, the very, very wide range of materials that he was reading. So he was actually relatively well read and relatively well educated, which means that he was aware of what was going on in the world and what was happening around him. So in terms of what inspired him to write this poem, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's an element of him having had, you know, quite a difficult upbringing, in that, you know, by the age of 15, his father was really, he was quite kind of beaten down by life and quite ill, and so Robert, at the age of 15, was essentially the chief labourer on the family farm. So, you know, that in itself is very difficult, and he recognises this with the mouse, you know, that the mouse has worked really, really hard to try and survive, and it's all gone wrong. And Burns has seen the same thing as he's been growing up, where the family have worked hard, and his father in particular has worked hard, but things happen outside their control, and that makes life even more difficult. But I think that, you know, that there's kind of a bigger picture going on here, because what we see with the story of this of this poem is a mouse having its home destroyed, and so its life being destroyed. Burns is writing this 1785. We're only 40 years after the Jacobite uprising and the Battle of Culloden. So Bonnie Prince Charlie has been defeated by the English forces, and this really is the kind of last stand that Scotland makes in trying to reclaim her independence. And off the back of that defeat, we start seeing the Highland way of life being destroyed. We start having what's now called the Highland clearances, where the kind of tenant farmers were being cleared off the land because it was more profitable for the landowners to put sheep onto the land, to fence it off and put sheep on the land, because that made them more money than the rents did from these little tenant farmers. And then a lot of these Highlanders who suddenly found themselves without homes and without farms were emigrating, a lot of them over to Canada and to America. And so Burns saw this as being a way of life that's being destroyed, and so he links this to the idea of the mouse's home and the mouse's life being destroyed, to comment on the fact that the people with the power and the money are destroying another way of life. And that's something that I think continues to inspire him as he moves forward. In 6 or 7 years after this poem was written, he joins forces with an Edinburgh publisher called George Thompson, and they take on the task of collecting lots of songs and tunes from around Scotland and publishing them. And I think that at the back of this, part of what Burns is trying to do is to capture and preserve that aspect of Scottish culture and Scottish heritage, so that it's not lost and it's not destroyed. So I think that there's a few things going on here in Burns's mind as he sees this mouse. There is that immediate idea of the mouse having its home destroyed, but there is that bigger picture of his own life having been difficult, and people who lived near him having similar issues, and then the national picture, the idea of Scottish culture and the Scottish way of life also being destroyed.
Right. Okay. That's a lot of meaning from.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you do, again, as I said, you see this with a lot of Burns's poems. There is that surface reading, and there's a great message from that. But if you do a little bit of work around it and a little bit of research into the times that he's living in and what else is happening, suddenly you start seeing these other references coming through.
Right. And when he said, "Still thou art blessed compared with me, the present only toucheth thee," and when he said, "And forward though I cannot see, I guess in fear,"
mm-hmm.
What do you think he meant by that?
So this, for Burns, I think here what you're seeing is what he sees as the curse of humanity. He talks in the second stanza about man's dominion with nature's social union. So he's echoing back to the story in Genesis where God gives man dominion over the animals. And what you see here with this final verse is kind of a curse of that dominion, because the mouse and animals generally, they only live for the moment. They live for now. What am I doing now? And they act on instinct. And so the mouse says, right, autumn's over, winter's coming, I have to build my house. And that's what he does. Whereas man can look forward and can predict what's coming. They can look back on what's happened already and use those lessons from the past to predict what might happen in the future. And because Burns is looking back and he's seeing a difficult life where there's been perhaps bad harvests, then he looks forward and he sees it being difficult again because we've got to survive. And so, although you can never predict absolutely to the finest detail what it is that's going to happen in the future, you have a good enough an idea that you look forward and you think, yeah, this is not going to be good. I fear what's actually going to come. So it finishes on quite a kind of a melancholy note. It really makes you think about, well, if I think about the future and what the future's going to bring, do I think it's going to be something positive? And for Burns in this poem, it's not. It's absolutely going to be a negative thing that's going to be coming, whether it's the death of the mouse or the failure of the harvest or the loss of the kind of Scottish way of life.
Right. So would you say what he's talking about is kind of the curse of intelligence and knowledge?
Yeah, it is in a way. The kind of the curse of foreknowledge. The curse of not just living for the moment, of being able to look forward. Definitely.
Okay. And Sophie just left. Let's see. Is there anything that we haven't asked you about that you think should be covered?
No, I think we've been pretty comprehensive with this. It's been lovely to have a chat about it because it's my own personal favourite poem. It's really the first poem of Burns that I got into in any detail when I studied it myself in school. So it's lovely to come back to it and to speak about it a bit more. But yeah, I think we've kind of covered an awful lot of what there is in there to look at.
Okay. Cool. And let's see. Before we end, could you tell us a little bit about your work at and what school you work at?
Absolutely. So I am based in the Centre for Robert Burns Studies, which, as you said in your introduction, it's part of the Department of Scottish Literature at the University of Glasgow here in Scotland. I'm approaching the middle of my second year of my doctoral studies. So I'm working on a 4-year project, which at the moment doesn't deal with Burns's poetry an awful lot. At the moment, I'm very much working with his personal correspondence and his personal writing, so his letters and his journals. And what I'm doing is I'm exploring predominantly his mental health and looking at the impact that had on his life. So when you read his letters, he talks quite regularly about episodes of melancholy. He calls them things like blue devilism, and about, how these make him, they silence his muse. He can't write his poetry. Sometimes they're so bad that he takes to bed for a few weeks. Which, when you think about in the time that Burns is living, if you don't work, you don't make money, and when you've got a wife and 6 or 7 or 8 children at home, you need to be earning. So that shows you just kind of how serious these episodes were. But they've never really been properly studied within the context of his life and within the context of his poetry. So that's really what my research is doing. It's looking at those episodes. We're looking at them through a modern lens, so looking at them in relation to how a psychiatrist nowadays would diagnose clinical depression and bipolar disorder. And then what we're going to do as we move forward is look at episodes where he was feeling particularly down or he was feeling particularly up, and whether they had any sort of effect on the decisions that he was making in his life, his behaviour and his activity. What type of poetry was he writing, for example? Is there an impact there in terms of those? And I think you see, a little bit of that with To a Mouse, where he is quite, he kind of turns in the way, and he's very thoughtful and quite pessimistic. He looks forward and he dreads what's coming. And you see that in his letters, when you get to the summer after this poem's written, in fact, almost exactly a year after this poem is written, when you get to November 1786, he goes to Edinburgh for the first time, where he's published his poetry, he's becoming famous, people want to help him publish another volume, and he talks about how he dreads being dragged into the public glare, and because he knows that people will judge him, and he feels really quite dark and quite down on the whole idea, when actually you would expect him to be saying, oh, this is fantastic, everybody knows who I am, they all want to buy my book, they want me to come to their parties. So it's really interesting insight into a different aspect of the man, rather than just looking at him as, with his political beliefs or his religious beliefs, or, the man who had lots of affairs or went out and got, horrendously drunk every other night. It's an aspect of his life that's never really been studied. And we hope it's going to give us a bit more of an insight into Burns as a man, as well as Burns as a poet.
Right. And
so first of all, what was your favorite part of the poem?
That's a really, really tricky question. I don't think I can say, oh, this is my favourite line. I think my favourite part of the poem is the big message that comes through. And I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's that message of compassion. Burns recognises that what he's done from the mouse's perspective is terrible, and he really regrets it. And he starts, he kind of thinks about, but I can empathise there, I can feel what you're feeling and I can understand that. And getting to that idea of we should be aware of the consequences of our actions, and not just the consequences for ourselves, but the consequences for other people. And that, as I said, that's a thread that kind of continues through some of his other poems. So another one of his very famous poems, A Man's a Man for All That, is very much about the idea that all men are equal, and we shouldn't give people status because they have money or because they have power, but it should be about their actions. It should be about how we treat each other. And there's a wonderful letter that he writes where he talks about how he wishes that he could wipe all tears from all eyes. And I think for me, this poem, this idea of I wish that I could make things better, I know that life is difficult and I wish I could help, is the thing that comes through. It's that human message, I think. But also, although he finishes on that kind of quite sad note about you look forward and you fear what's coming, I can't help but think that the poem also gives us a little bit of hope, because if Burns feels like this, if Burns thinks I should treat other people better, then there must be other people out there who also believe that. And if all of these people start treating other people better, then the world's going to become a better place and we'll all start being nicer to each other. So I think that kind of message of compassion and empathy and caring for each other, I think that's probably my favourite part of the poem.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a great point. Also, another thing I wanted to ask is, since you have such a beautiful, great Scottish accent, I'm sure our listeners would really like it if you could recite the poem.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is To a Mouse on Turning Her Up in Her Nest with the Plough, November 1785, by Robert Burns. Wee, sleekit, coorin', timorous beastie, oh, what a panic's in thy breastie! Thou needna start away sae hasty wi' bicker and brattle. I would be laith to rin and chase thee wi' murder and pattle. I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union, and justifies that ill opinion which makes thee startle at me, thy poor earth-born companion and fellow mortal. I doubt na whiles but thou may thieve. What then? Poor beastie, thou mun live. A day my nickering a thrave's a sma' request. I'll get a blessing with the lave and never missed. Thy wee bit housie too in ruin, it silly was the winds are strewing, and naething now to big and newin, a foggage green. And bleak December's winds ensuing, baith snell and keen. Thou saw the fields laid bare and waste, and weary winter coming fast, and cosy here beneath the blast thou thought to dwell, till crash the cruel coulter passed out through thy cell. That wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee money a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for a' thy trouble, but house are hailed to thaw the winter's sleety dribble and Cranwick called. But Mousie, thou art no thy lane, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang after gley, and lay is naught but grief and pain for promised joy. Still, thou art blessed compared wi' me, the present only toucheth thee, but och, I backward cast my ee on prospects drear, and forward, though I canna see, I guess and fear.
Wow.
That was great.
Wow. Thanks so much. And
no problem.
Something interesting, at least I noticed, was the difference between how we say it as, I'd say, beginners to this poem, and how you said it as an expert on this poem. I thought that was kind of interesting.
It is. It's lovely. Do you know, it's one of the things that I really, really enjoy about working with Burns. Is that he does have, he has a massive following all over the world, but especially in North America. And it's great to hear, these Scots words, which to me, they're my mother tongue, and I'm used to hearing them, and I'm used to hearing them in the Scots accent, and I love hearing other people speaking them. Sometimes it sounds, kind of slightly odd, but it's great to hear the language being brought alive with so many different voices, because I think at the end of the day, that was one of Burns's big things. It was about giving voice to everyone, voices that might not otherwise have been heard. So to hear his words spoken by other voices is really lovely, and it's an aspect that I really enjoy getting a chance to engage with.
Right. And if someone wants to, let's say, learn some more about Robert Burns, or they really take an interest in it, like you have, what are some resources you'd recommend for them?
I think it really depends on kind of what you want to get into and really where you want to start getting into it. I think a great place to start would actually be the website for the Centre for Robert Burns Studies here in Glasgow. So if you Google Glasgow University and Centre for Robert Burns Studies, you'll find you'll find us really quickly. There's a whole heap of new resources that have gone up there recently, and there's new stuff being added all the time, including some musical arrangements of the songs as they would have been played in Burns's time. So that's all really interesting. The other place that's worth a look is the website for the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum. Again, if you Google that, you'll pick it up really quickly. They have got a fantastic online resource where they've got a timeline, so you can learn more about the poet's birth. They've got various pictures and whatnot of the Birthplace Museum. But what they've also got is a lot of their holdings related to Burns have been digitised, so you can look at photos of the manuscripts for some of his poems and his letters and various objects that are in some way related to Burns. So that's always great to explore. But Burns will turn up all over the place. If you're particularly interested in the work that I'm doing, looking at his mental health, then you can always pick up my project blog. I am on bluedevilism.wordpress.com, or you can find me on Twitter at bluedevilism. And if you have a look, if you pick up the blog, there's a links page on there which will also feed you through to some other really valuable resources and information repositories that will let you look at Burns as a man, at his life, at his poetry, and his legacy in terms of how he is remembered around the world right through to this day.
Okay, thanks. And just before we wrap up, could you tell us a little bit about the Glasgow University?
So Glasgow University, it's one of Scotland's 4 ancient universities, so it's been on the go for a really long time. I'm going to get this horrendously wrong. I think it's about 450 years old now. It's situated in the west end of Glasgow. It's got a gorgeous campus. The running joke is that it's really Hogwarts, and if you go onto the website for Glasgow University, that's www.gla.ac.uk, you'll see pictures of our big main building, and it really does look like Hogwarts. It's that kind of big old Gothic architecture, and really they do everything. I'm based within the College of Arts, which does all our literature and history, all the kind of humanities based subjects. But we then also have one of the largest medical schools in Scotland. We have one of Scotland's 2 veterinary science schools. we have, engineering, social sciences, the whole spectrum. And it's a great place. It's a very, very international campus. So I actually work with American students who come over here to do a semester of study with us, and we have students who come also from Canada, from South America. We have a lot of students who come from China and Malaysia over in the Far East. So it's a great place to be. It's a great place to meet other people. And of course, it's situated in Glasgow, which is probably one of the friendliest cities in the whole world.
That's great.
Cool. And so, do you want to say anything before we wrap up?
No? Is there anything you'd like to say, Moira?
I think that all that's left for me to say is thank you for asking me to do this. It's been great fun chatting with you guys, and it's been great to go back to a poem that I've loved for years and years and years now, and to share my love and my passion for Robert Burns with you and with your listeners.
Yeah, thank you for being on the podcast.
And thanks so much for sharing your knowledge.
You're very welcome.